The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the swinging doors of the Silver Rose, Sarah Miller's saloon in Silver City. The establishment stood as a testament to her determination, rising from the dust of the New Mexico territory like a defiant bloom in the desert. Sarah adjusted the pearl-handled revolver at her hip as she surveyed her domain. Polished mahogany bar, red velvet curtains, and the organized chaos of a Friday evening coming to life. Through the windows, she could see the imposing brick facade of the newly constructed First Methodist Church across the street, a stark reminder of the changing times. Reverend Samuel Thompson had arrived 6 months ago with grand plans to civilize Silver City. But Sarah had learned long ago to trust her instincts about men who wrapped their ambitions in scripture. Elizabeth Davis, Sarah's most trusted girl, hurried down the stairs, her face pale despite the rouge on her cheeks. Miss Sarah. Emma Wilson never came back from her morning walk. Catherine's beside herself, says Emma mentioned a strange man watching her these past few days. Sarah's hand tightened on the bar rail, remembering the third girl who'd vanished from Abilene last month under similar circumstances. The saloon's regulars were starting to filter in, including Jake Johnson, a silver miner with honest eyes and calloused hands who'd been sweet on Emma for months. Sarah caught his worried glance toward Emma's usual spot by the piano. 2 months ago, she'd have dismissed a missing girl as just another drifter moving on, but something felt different this time. The territory was changing, and not for the better. Thunder rolled in the distance as Sarah stepped onto the boardwalk, watching Reverend Thompson lead his evening prayer meeting. The businessman who'd arrived with him, William Davis, stood at his side like a well-dressed shadow. Sarah had seen the way Davis looked at her girls. Not with the righteous disgust he claimed, but with calculation, like a man counting inventory. Inside her office, Sarah unfolded a worn letter from her friend Mary Thompson in Fort Worth, warning of a trafficking ring moving through Texas into the territories. The descriptions matched the pattern she'd been seeing: religious revival meetings, missing women, and a mysterious businessman always at the preacher's side. The pieces were starting to form a disturbing picture. James Miller, Sarah's younger brother and the only lawman she trusted within 100 miles, had been tracking similar disappearances along the border. His latest telegram suggested the women were being moved south, their captors using church missions as cover. Sarah had learned to survive by minding her own business, but Emma wasn't just an employee, she was family. The evening crowd grew rowdier as Thomas Wilson, the local banker, arrived with his usual entourage of mining investors. Sarah noticed William Davis slip away from the church meeting to join them, his manner suddenly less pious than during Sunday services. She dispatched Elizabeth to serve their table, knowing the girl's sharp ears would catch any useful information. Jake approached the bar, his voice low and urgent. "Miss Sarah, I followed Emma's usual walking path this morning, found this caught on a fence post near the old mission." He placed a torn piece of blue calico on the bar, the same pattern as Emma's favorite dress. Sarah felt her blood run cold, remembering Emma's stories of a gentleman who'd been offering to help fallen women start new lives in respectable communities. The storm finally broke over Silver City, rain drumming against the roof as Sarah studied the town through her office window. The church stood dark and silent now, but lamplight still burned in William Davis's room at the Grand Hotel. She'd built the Silver Rose from nothing, creating a haven for women who had nowhere else to turn. If Davis and his supposed moral crusade thought they could destroy that, they'd learn why even the roughest cowboys treated Sarah Miller with cautious respect. Elizabeth slipped into the office, her face flushed with excitement. "Miss Sarah, I heard Davis talking about a special train car being added to tomorrow's southbound freight. Said something about delivering the goods to someone named Thomas in Tombstone." Sarah nodded slowly, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. She'd always known the Silver Rose might put her in an early grave, but she'd never thought it would be for fighting on the side of the angels. Sarah gathered her most trusted people as midnight approached. Jake Johnson had already volunteered his help, his feelings for Emma, overcoming his usual caution. Elizabeth would coordinate with Catherine to maintain appearances at the saloon, while James was riding hard from Fort Worth with information they'd need. The storm had passed, leaving behind a charged anticipation in the air. Tomorrow would change everything in Silver City, one way or another. Sarah stood at her window watching the first hints of dawn creep over the eastern horizon, her fingers absently tracing the worn edges of the letter James had managed to smuggle north. The carefully coded message confirmed her worst fears about Thomas's operation in Tombstone. Young women lured with promises of respectable work, only to disappear into a network of hidden brothels and opium dens stretching deep into Mexico. The moral crusade was just an elaborate smokescreen designed to drive legitimate businesses like the Silver Rose out, while establishing a monopoly on vice that would make Thomas and his partners wealthy beyond measure. A soft knock at the door revealed Elizabeth, dark circles under her eyes betraying a sleepless night. "The girls are ready, Miss Sarah." Catherine's got them practicing their parts, and Jake's men are in position along the railway line. Sarah nodded, studying the young woman who'd grown from a frightened runaway into one of her most capable allies. "Any word from William?" Elizabeth shook her head. "Nothing since he rode out to scout the southern pass. But Samuel's back. Says he spotted 3 wagons heading toward the freight depot, all carrying crates marked as church supplies." Sarah pulled her ledger from the false bottom of her desk drawer, quickly noting down the latest intelligence. The pieces were falling into place, but timing would be crucial. If they moved too soon, Thomas's men would simply delay their shipment and change their route. Too late, and more innocent women would vanish into that dark network, joining Emma and the others they'd already lost. The thought of Emma, barely 18 and full of dreams about becoming a schoolteacher, made Sarah's hand tighten around her pen until her knuckles whitened. Outside, Silver City was stirring to life. The morning stage rattled past, kicking up dust that filtered through the warped window panes. Sarah could hear Catherine's voice drifting up from the saloon floor, sharp and clear as she drilled the girls on their roles in the coming deception. They'd transform the Silver Rose into exactly the kind of garish, obvious trap Thomas's men would expect, complete with heavily made-up women, loud music, and the suggestion of easy virtue. Meanwhile, the real operation would unfold in the shadows as Jake's carefully chosen cowboys moved into position. Sarah checked her timepiece against the railway schedule James had provided. The freight train would arrive at mid-morning, pause for water and coal, then continue south toward Tombstone. During that brief window, they needed to identify which car held the captive women, neutralize any guards, and execute a rescue without raising alarms that would alert Thomas's network. The entire plan balanced on a knife's edge, with a dozen ways it could go wrong and only one narrow path to success. Mary appeared in the doorway, her usual confident demeanor subdued. "Got word from the telegraph office. James made it to Fort Worth, but he's being watched. Says Thomas has men at every major station between here and Abilene." She handed Sarah a carefully folded paper. "He managed to get this list out, though. Names of officials Thomas has in his pocket, including 2 federal marshals." Sarah scanned the names, her expression hardening. The corruption went deeper than she'd imagined, reaching into levels of power that could make their task even more dangerous. The morning sun had fully cleared the horizon now, painting the town in shades of gold and amber. Sarah moved to her weapons cabinet, selecting a derringer that could be easily concealed in her skirts and a more substantial revolver for her desk. The weight of the guns was reassuring. She'd hoped to leave violence behind when she'd opened the Silver Rose, but fate had other plans. Today would determine not just the future of her saloon, but the lives of countless women who deserved better than becoming pawns in Thomas's cruel game. As if reading her thoughts, Elizabeth spoke softly. "We'll find Emma, Miss Sarah. Her and all the others." Sarah managed a tight smile, touched by the fierce determination in the younger woman's voice. They had to succeed, not just for Emma, but for every girl who'd ever sought refuge within the Silver Rose's walls. Sarah Miller hadn't built this place by backing down from bullies, whether they wore badges or carried Bibles. Thomas was about to learn exactly why even the roughest elements in Silver City treated her with respect. Sarah Miller wiped down the polished oak bar of the Silver Rose, her saloon in Silver City, as she watched the street through grimy windows. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty thoroughfare, where a group of well-dressed men led by Samuel Thompson strode purposefully toward her establishment. Her heart quickened. The banker's 4th visit this week couldn't mean anything good. Elizabeth Davis, Sarah's most trusted girl, appeared at her elbow with an empty serving tray clutched to her chest. "They're coming back again," she whispered, her face pinched with worry. "Mary says she overheard Thompson telling Reverend Wilson they're planning to petition the territorial governor to shut down all the saloons in Silver City." "Let them try," Sarah replied, though her stomach churned. She'd built this place from nothing after her husband died, providing safe work for women with few options. The Silver Rose wasn't just some common dive. She ran a clean establishment where the girls were treated with respect. But lately, Thompson and his moral crusaders had been making life difficult. The door swung open with a creak, admitting Thompson and his associates. Sarah noted James Wilson, the zealous young reverend, along with William Johnson, the new deputy marshal who seemed more interested in Thompson's deep pockets than actual law enforcement. The banker's neat suit and carefully trimmed mustache couldn't hide the predatory gleam in his eyes. "Miss Miller," Thompson said smoothly, removing his hat. "I trust you've considered our generous offer to purchase your property? Silver City is growing respectable. This establishment's reputation no longer suits our community's character." His practiced smile didn't reach his cold eyes as he placed a folded document on the bar. Sarah's fingers itched to crumple the paper, but she maintained her composure. "My answer hasn't changed, Mr. Thompson. The Silver Rose isn't for sale at any price." She noted how his associates positioned themselves around the room. Wilson by the stairs, Johnson near the back door. Something about their movements raised her instincts. That evening, after Thompson's group departed, Sarah noticed Catherine Thompson was missing. The quiet blonde had been one of her newer girls, claiming to be a widow from Fort Worth. Now Sarah wondered if there was more to her story, especially given her surname. The timing of her disappearance and Thompson's increasing pressure seemed suspiciously connected. Elizabeth helped Sarah search Catherine's room, finding most of her belongings still in place. Only her shawl and reticule were missing, suggesting she hadn't planned to leave. A crumpled note beneath the bed caught Sarah's eye, hastily scrawled words about meeting someone behind the livery stable. The handwriting looked masculine, educated. Jake Davis, Sarah's part-time bouncer and longtime friend, returned from asking questions around town. His weathered face was grim as he reported that several people had seen Catherine being forced into a wagon late last night. The men matched descriptions of Thompson's associates, but no one had intervened, assuming it was official business. Over the next few days, Sarah noticed other changes. More of Thompson's men watching the saloon. Strange wagons moving at night. Whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. She began keeping detailed notes, sensing a larger scheme behind the banker's moral crusade. Thompson's pressure to buy her out seemed less about respectability and more about controlling this particular location. Emma Wilson, the Reverend's wife, visited Sarah secretly one evening. The normally proper woman was clearly distressed as she revealed discovering coded ledgers in her husband's study. Documents suggesting involvement in some sort of trafficking operation. Names, dates, and destinations that made no sense for a religious mission. Sarah's investigation led her to Thomas Miller, a grizzled former Texas Ranger working as a freelance detective. He confirmed her suspicions. Thompson's banking network stretched across the territory, with similar patterns of saloon purchases and missing women in other towns. But proving it would be dangerous, especially with law enforcement in his pocket. The pieces started fitting together when Sarah overheard two of Thompson's men discussing shipments and routes. The Silver Rose's location near the territorial border made it perfect for moving contraband and people. Thompson's moral campaign was just cover for establishing control of key transport points. Sarah realized Catherine might have discovered the truth and paid the price. Elizabeth brought more troubling news. Mary had vanished after her evening shift, leaving only a torn piece of paper with partial writing about Tombstone and warehouse. Sarah knew she had to act fast before another girl disappeared. But going against Thompson meant risking everything she'd built, and possibly her life. Working with Thomas Miller, Sarah began gathering evidence and allies. Jake Davis recruited trusted men to watch the saloon while she followed leads. Emma Wilson provided copies of documents from her husband's office. Even a few townspeople who'd initially supported Thompson's crusade started questioning his true motives. The scope of Thompson's operation became clear. A network of reformed saloons acting as fronts for moving illegal liquor and trafficking women across territorial lines. His banking connections provided cover for the money, while his religious facade deflected suspicion. Sarah realized saving her saloon meant exposing the entire criminal enterprise. The desert wind carried whispers of danger as Sarah and Jake rode toward Tombstone under cover of darkness. They'd traced Mary's last known whereabouts to a warehouse district on the outskirts of town, where Thompson's missionary supply operation maintained several buildings. The moon cast long shadows across the empty streets, every creak and rustle setting their nerves on edge. Sarah's hand rested on the derringer hidden in her skirts, a gift from Elizabeth years ago when she'd first opened the saloon. The weight of it provided little comfort as she recalled Emma's latest intelligence. Thompson had scheduled a large shipment to arrive tonight, supposedly carrying Bibles and hymn books. But the manifest Emma had copied told a different story, listing barrels of sacramental wine that far exceeded any church's needs. Thomas Miller had positioned trusted men around the warehouse district, blending in with the usual rough crowd that gathered near the rail yards. Through his connections as a freight operator, he'd learned Thompson's operation used a complex system of cargo transfers to move both liquor and women between Tombstone, Silver City, and Fort Worth. The reformed saloons in each town served as distribution points, with the women forced to work while appearing to be saved souls. The warehouse loomed before them, its weathered boards silvered by moonlight. Sarah dismounted, her boots raising small clouds of dust as Jake secured their horses. Through a gap in the planks, she caught glimpses of movement inside, men loading crates onto wagons while others stood guard. Her heart nearly stopped when she spotted Mary, bound and huddled with two other women in a corner. A commotion from the street drew the guards' attention, Thomas's men creating a diversion with a staged brawl. Sarah and Jake used the distraction to slip inside through a loose board at the rear. The interior reeked of cheap whiskey and fear, barrels stacked alongside crates marked with false church credentials. They crouched behind the cargo, watching Thompson himself direct operations while preaching about salvation to his captive audience. Emma's husband William arrived as planned, playing his role as a newly converted supporter of Thompson's cause. His presence drew Thompson into conversation, allowing Sarah and Jake to edge closer to the imprisoned women. Mary's eyes widened in recognition, but she remained silent. Sarah's fingers worked quickly at the ropes while Jake kept watch, his hand never far from his holster. The rescue attempt nearly faltered when Catherine, one of Thompson's loyal followers, entered unexpectedly. She paused, seeing Sarah in the shadows, but something in her expression changed as she glanced at the terrified women. Without a word, she turned and walked out, leaving the door unlocked behind her. Sarah realized not all of Thompson's believers were willing participants in his crimes. As they led the women toward freedom, chaos erupted outside. James, the local sheriff, who'd been skeptical of Thompson's crusade, arrived with a posse. Emma's evidence had finally convinced him to act. Gunfire erupted as Thompson's men realized their operation was compromised. Sarah hurried the rescued women through the confusion while Jake provided covering fire. Thompson himself attempted to flee but found his escape route blocked by Thomas's men. In a final act of desperation, he tried to blame everything on his subordinates, claiming ignorance of their activities. But the documentation Emma had gathered, combined with the scene in the warehouse, told the true story. The facade of religious reformation crumbled, revealing the corrupt enterprise beneath. Dawn broke over Tombstone as Thompson and his main conspirators were led away in chains. Sarah held Mary close, knowing their ordeal wasn't over. Other women remained trapped in Thompson's network across the territory. But they'd struck the first blow, and with their growing alliance of honest citizens and lawmen, they could continue working to dismantle the trafficking operation one town at a time. Back at her saloon, Sarah looked at the faces of her girls with new determination. They weren't just employees, they were family, and she'd fight to protect them all. The battle against Thompson had shown her the power of unity against corruption, and she knew their struggle would inspire others to stand against similar operations hiding behind respectability's mask. Sarah Miller stared at the crude map sketched on parchment, her finger tracing the winding route from Silver City toward the Mexican border where her missing girls were allegedly being held. The flickering oil lamp cast dancing shadows across the saloon's empty tables as she studied the information that Elizabeth Wilson, one of her dancers who'd escaped the trafficking operation, had desperately scrawled before collapsing from exhaustion. The revelation that Samuel Thompson, the supposedly pious businessman who'd been crusading to shut down her establishment, was actually running an underground railroad of forced prostitution, had filled Sarah with a cold fury. For months, he'd paraded through Silver City with his temperance meetings and moral lectures, all while secretly funneling innocent women across the border through a network of corrupt officials and hired thugs. Jake Davis, the grizzled trail scout who'd been helping Sarah investigate the disappearances, cleared his throat from his position by the window. Thompson's men are moving tonight. Saw them loading up wagons behind that new church of his. His weathered face was grim. If we're gonna get those girls back, it's gotta be now, before they vanish into Mexico for good. Sarah checked her shotgun one final time, the smooth walnut stock cool against her palm. She'd never imagined when she first opened the Silver Belle Saloon that she'd end up leading an armed rescue mission. But these were her girls, the ones society looked down on but who'd become family to her. Catherine, Mary, and Emma had trusted her to keep them safe, and she'd failed them. She wouldn't fail them again. The unlikely rescue party gathered in the shadows behind the saloon. Sarah, Jake, Elizabeth, who insisted on coming despite her injuries, and William Johnson, the town's alcoholic doctor who'd sobered up the moment he learned what was happening to the missing women. They all knew the odds were against them, 4 against Thompson's dozen hired guns. But they also knew they were the only hope those girls had. Jake led them through the moonlit hills, following tracks only his experienced eyes could see. The cool night air carried the scent of sage and dust as they worked their way south. Sarah's mind raced with memories of Thompson's smug sermons about cleaning up Silver City, how he'd played on people's prejudices while building his criminal empire right under their noses. The hypocrisy made her blood boil. They found Thompson's camp shortly before dawn, a collection of canvas tents nestled in a box canyon, with armed men patrolling the perimeter. Through her spyglass, Sarah could make out several covered wagons where the captive women were likely being held. Her heart clenched when she spotted Catherine being roughly dragged between tents, her face bruised, but her spine still straight with defiance. What happened next unfolded like a fever dream. William created a diversion by setting fire to the horse corral, while Jake picked off the sentries with his rifle. Sarah and Elizabeth used the chaos to reach the wagons, finding Mary and Emma bound inside along with women from other towns. The sound of gunfire echoed off the canyon walls as Thompson's operation erupted into violence. Sarah came face to face with Samuel Thompson himself as she was leading the last group of women to safety. The businessman's genial mask had cracked, revealing the monster beneath as he leveled a pistol at her chest. "You're destroying everything I've built," he snarled. "These whores were better off under my protection than serving drinks in your den of sin." The crack of Elizabeth's derringer caught them both by surprise. Thompson staggered, red blooming across his pristine white shirt as he looked down in shock. Sarah didn't waste the opportunity, driving the butt of her shotgun into his temple and watching with grim satisfaction as he crumpled to the dirt. "The only sin here was thinking you could prey on my girls," she spat. Dawn was breaking as they led the rescued women back towards Silver City, the morning sun painting the desert in shades of gold and rose. Several of Thompson's men were dead. Others fled into the hills, and the rest were bound for the territorial prison once the federal marshals arrived. Sarah's arms ached from supporting Catherine's limping form, but her heart was lighter than it had been in months. The story of what really happened in Thompson's moral crusade spread quickly through the border territories. Other saloon owners and madams came forward with similar tales, exposing a vast network of trafficking and corruption. Sarah's stand against Thompson became a rallying cry for those fighting to protect vulnerable women in the lawless frontier. Back at the Silver Belle, Sarah watched her girls serving drinks and dancing, now with armed guards posted at every door. The saloon had become more than just a business. It was a sanctuary where women could work safely and support each other. Elizabeth had taken charge of teaching the younger girls self-defense, while Mary organized a network to help women escape abusive situations. As Sarah made her nightly rounds, checking locks and counting the day's earnings, she reflected on how this crisis had transformed both her and her establishment. The Silver Belle was still considered scandalous by proper society, but now it was also known as a place where women could find protection and justice when the law failed them. Sometimes, she mused, the most righteous path wasn't the most respectable one. The quiet evening at the Silver Belle erupted into chaos when Elizabeth burst through the swinging doors, her face pale with urgency. "Thompson's men are loading wagons at the old mission," she gasped, clutching a crumpled letter. Mary followed one of his new converts and discovered they're moving tonight. Dozens of women locked in false-bottom carriages bound for Mexico. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized this was the evidence they'd been waiting for. In the flickering lamplight of her office, Sarah gathered her most trusted allies. Elizabeth laid out a rough map drawn from Mary's reconnaissance, showing the convoy's planned route through Shadow Canyon. Catherine, their newest girl who'd escaped Thompson's clutches months ago, pointed out the hidden trails she remembered from her own terrifying journey. "There's a narrow pass," she whispered, "where the wagons have to go single file." Sarah dispatched riders to alert both the territorial marshal in Silver City and their allies in Fort Worth, but she knew help would arrive too late. The women of the Silver Belle would have to act tonight. As they armed themselves with rifles and revolvers from Sarah's private arsenal, she saw not dancing girls and barmaids, but warriors preparing for battle. Each had suffered at the hands of men like Thompson. Each had found refuge within these walls. Emma, their youngest, worked frantically to transform the saloon's delivery wagons, hiding compartments under false hay bales where armed women could lie in wait. The plan was daring. They would pose as a merchant caravan that had broken down in the canyon, forcing Thompson's convoy to stop. Sarah knew the risk was enormous, but the alternative was unthinkable. As they rode out under the cover of darkness, Sarah thought of how Thompson had underestimated them all along. He'd seen the Silver Belle as a den of sin, never recognizing it was a fortress of strength. The women moved silently through the desert night, their horses' hooves muffled by cloth wrappings. The moon cast long shadows across the rocky terrain as they positioned themselves along the canyon walls. Hours passed in tense silence until the distant rumble of wagons echoed through the canyon. Sarah gave the signal, and Emma drove their lead wagon into position, blocking the narrow pass. Thompson's convoy approached, lanterns swaying in the darkness. Sarah's heart pounded as she watched his lead rider approach Emma, who played the role of distressed traveler perfectly. The moment Thompson himself emerged from his carriage, Sarah's blood boiled. He wore the collar of a preacher now, his false piety a shield for his true nature. When he moved to backhand Emma for her insolence, Sarah's signal split the night. The women of the Silver Belle rose from their hiding places like avenging angels, rifles gleaming in the moonlight. What followed was chaos and gunfire, but Sarah's girls had the high ground and the element of surprise. Thompson's men, expecting no resistance from their cargo, found themselves surrounded by determined women who knew how to shoot. The battle was fierce but brief, ending with Thompson on his knees, his holy collar stained with desert dust. As dawn broke over the canyon, territorial marshals finally arrived to find Thompson and his men bound and their intended victims freed. The converted women from his mission stumbled from the wagons, blinking in the harsh light of truth. Sarah watched as Elizabeth and Mary wrapped blankets around their shoulders, guiding them toward water and safety. The aftermath brought changes no one had expected. The territorial governor, faced with undeniable evidence of Thompson's crimes, granted the Silver Belle official recognition as a women's shelter. Sarah's girls were deputized as special constables, authorized to protect and defend those seeking refuge. The saloon remained open, but now it openly served its true purpose, a fortress where justice and mercy met. In the weeks that followed, women from across the territory made their way to the Silver Belle, each carrying stories of escape and survival. Sarah expanded the upper floors, adding proper dormitories and a schoolroom where Elizabeth taught reading and writing alongside self-defense. The sound of gunfire was replaced by the scratch of pencils and the murmur of women learning to reshape their own destinies. Thompson's trial became a sensation, revealing the vast network of corruption that had allowed his operation to flourish. But the real story, whispered around campfires and carried on stagecoaches, was of the saloon women who had dared to stand against him. The Silver Belle became legend not for its liquor or cards, but for the fierce spirit of freedom it represented in a land where justice was still being defined. Sarah Wilson stood on the porch of her saloon in Silver City as the first rays of dawn painted the mountains gold. The events of the past weeks had led to this moment. The truth about Samuel Thompson's operation was finally exposed. Her girls were safe, rescued from the hidden compound near the Mexican border where Thompson had been trafficking women under the guise of moral reform. The local telegraph operator had been instrumental, intercepting coded messages between Thompson and his partners in Fort Worth. What appeared to be innocent correspondence about establishing churches and temperance societies had actually been a sophisticated system for coordinating the movement of kidnapped women across state lines. Sarah's heart ached thinking of how many lives had been destroyed before they uncovered the truth. Catherine Davis, one of Sarah's most trusted girls, had barely escaped with her life after infiltrating Thompson's operation. She'd witnessed firsthand how he used his reputation as a crusading businessman to mask his true nature. The rehabilitation homes he established were actually holding pens where women were kept before being sold to brothels across the border. The thought made Sarah's blood boil. Marshal James Miller and his deputies had surrounded Tombstone's compound in the pre-dawn darkness. The ensuing firefight had been brutal, but mercifully brief. Tombstone's men, realizing they were outgunned, had surrendered quickly. But Tombstone himself had slipped away in the chaos, leaving a trail of evidence that damned him more thoroughly than any confession could have. Elizabeth Johnson, the young woman whose disappearance had first alerted Sarah to Tombstone's true nature, was among those rescued. She'd been working as a singer in Sarah's saloon when Tombstone's men had grabbed her, claiming they were saving her from a life of sin. Now she sat in Sarah's kitchen, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, slowly recounting the horrors she'd witnessed. William Davis, the town's principled banker who had initially supported Tombstone's supposed moral crusade, now worked tirelessly to trace the money trail. The web of corruption stretched far beyond Silver City, implicating supposedly respectable businessmen in Tombstone and Abilene. Each new revelation brought fresh waves of anger from the townspeople who'd been deceived. Jake Wilson, Sarah's younger brother and the town's deputy marshal, had tracked Tombstone for 3 days through the harsh border country. The businessman's fancy clothes and civilized manner hadn't prepared him for the brutal reality of life on the run. When Jake finally cornered him in a box canyon, Tombstone had begged for mercy, offering bribes and making grand promises. But Sarah had raised her brother to know right from wrong. Tombstone was brought back to Silver City in chains, his carefully constructed facade of respectability shattered forever. The trial that followed was brief but thorough, with testimony from dozens of women who'd suffered at his hands. The judge's sentence, hanging, was met with grim satisfaction by the townspeople. Mary Tombstone, Samuel's wife, had been as shocked as anyone by her husband's true nature. She'd believed in his mission to bring civilization to the frontier, never suspecting that her own comfortable lifestyle was built on human suffering. Now she worked alongside Sarah, using her connections to help the rescued women rebuild their lives. Emma Miller, the marshal's wife and the town's unofficial historian, documented everything. She understood that future generations needed to know how evil could hide behind a mask of virtue, how the real heroes weren't always the ones wearing badges or preaching from pulpits. Sometimes they were women like Sarah, who trusted their instincts and fought for what was right. The saloon remained open, a reminder that honest vice was preferable to hidden corruption. Sarah had installed a new piano, and on Saturday nights, Elizabeth's clear voice could be heard singing ballads that spoke of love and loss, hope and redemption. The girls who worked there did so by choice, protected by Sarah's fierce determination that no one would ever again be forced into bondage in Silver City. Thomas Johnson, the young telegraph operator who'd helped expose the trafficking ring, had found an unlikely romance with Catherine. Their wedding was held in Sarah's saloon, a celebration of life and love that brought together all the people who'd fought to bring Tombstone to justice. Even the most proper ladies in town attended, finally understanding that true morality couldn't be measured by appearances. As Sarah watched the sun climb higher over the mountains, she reflected on how their quiet border town had changed. The battle against Tombstone had brought out the best in some people and exposed the worst in others. But most importantly, it had shown that a community could come together to fight evil, regardless of social standing or occupation. The frontier might be lawless, but it wasn't without justice. Sarah's saloon became more than just a business. It transformed into a beacon of hope for women across the territory. She established a network of safe houses stretching from Silver City to Fort Worth, working with trusted allies to help anyone fleeing from abuse or trafficking. The former working girls who chose to stay on became partners in the enterprise, each owning shares in the establishment and having a voice in its operation. Catherine and Thomas's marriage inspired others to look beyond social conventions. Their home became a gathering place where former saloon girls mixed freely with merchants' wives, and where plans were made to improve the lives of everyone in Silver City. Catherine's experience with Tombstone's operation made her particularly effective at spotting signs of trafficking, and she worked tirelessly with Thomas to monitor telegraph communications for suspicious patterns. The town council, chastened by how thoroughly Tombstone had deceived them, invited Sarah to join as its first female member. She used her position to advocate for better protection of vulnerable citizens and stricter oversight of new businesses coming to town. The same church ladies who had once picketed her saloon now sought her advice on charitable works and community initiatives. In the wake of Thompson's downfall, his extensive property holdings were seized and auctioned. Sarah and her girls pooled their resources to purchase several buildings, converting them into legitimate businesses run by women who wanted a fresh start. A dressmaker's shop, a bakery, and a boarding house for working women soon flourished under their management. Elizabeth, who had shown remarkable courage in helping to expose Thompson's operation, discovered a talent for investigative work. She began collaborating with lawmen across the territory, using her intelligence and observation skills to help track down other trafficking operations. Her reputation grew, until even marshals from as far as Tombstone sought her expertise. The saloon itself evolved, becoming more of a social club where people from all walks of life could gather safely. Sarah maintained strict rules about behavior and fair treatment of the women who worked there. The place became known as much for its excellent food and entertainment as for its drinks, and families would often gather there for Sunday dinner after church. Mary, one of the youngest girls Sarah had rescued from Thompson's operation, showed a particular aptitude for business. Under Sarah's mentorship, she learned to manage the saloon's books and eventually opened her own establishment in Abilene, creating another safe haven for women in need of protection or a fresh start. The transformation of Silver City attracted attention throughout the territory. Other towns sent representatives to study how Sarah and her allies had created such a successful model of community cooperation. The balance they struck between frontier freedom and civic responsibility became a template for other growing settlements. As the years passed, Sarah never forgot the lessons learned during their struggle against Thompson. She kept a loaded rifle behind the bar and maintained close friendships with law enforcement across the territory. But she also knew that their greatest protection came from the community they had built, one where people looked out for each other regardless of their background or profession. One crisp autumn morning, 5 years after Thompson's defeat, Sarah stood on her balcony watching the sunrise just as she had done that fateful day. The town below was stirring to life, its streets now paved, its buildings solid and well-maintained. She could see Thomas and Catherine walking to the telegraph office, their young daughter skipping between them. Elizabeth rode past on her way to meet with a marshal about another case. The sound of laughter drifted up from the saloon kitchen, where the morning crew was preparing for another day. Sarah smiled, remembering the fear and uncertainty that had once filled these same rooms. They had built something remarkable here, not just a business or a sanctuary, but a true community. The frontier was still wild, but in Silver City they had proven that justice and compassion could flourish even in the harshest conditions. As if to emphasize the point, a wagon train appeared on the horizon, bringing new settlers to their growing town. Sarah knew that among them would be people seeking a fresh start, just as she had once done. And just as others had helped her stand against evil, she would be ready to help them build their own stories of redemption and success in this place they all now called home.